darkness, impenetrable, damp. Smelling of wet earth, fear, and creeping things. A stone pit, its walls covered in slick slime, stretch up toward a tiny gray square of Northumbrian sky. Below, on a floor littered with the bones of previous victims, a man stands. His light, matted hair and beard are caked in filth and dried blood, but his blue eyes burn with an unbroken, icy fire. Around him, a living, hissing carpet of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of vipers. They are everywhere, coiling around his legs, slithering over his tunic, their forked tongues tasting the air, sensing his scent. This is King Ella of Northumbria, a petty and vain ruler who imagined this is how he could break the spirit of the greatest warrior the North had ever seen. Ragnar Lothbrok, whose name made kings tremble from Ireland to the Frankish lands, stands in this pit of death and smiles. He does not scream. He does not beg for mercy. Instead, he raises his head to the gray sky and begins to speak. Not to Ella, but to eternity, for the skalds who will write songs about him. His voice, hoarse but strong, carries over the pit, and every word is a hammer blow, forging his immortality. How the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. This is not a complaint. It is a prophecy. It is an announcement of war from beyond the grave. This scene, printed in the sagas, burned into collective memory, became the alpha and omega of his legend, a symbol of the indomitable Viking spirit. But what if it's all just a grand, brilliantly staged performance, played out not in a pit of snakes, but on the pages of parchment centuries later? What if the most famous death in the history of the North is the most beautiful and influential lie ever told? To understand this, we must return to the world that created this titan, a world ready to explode with fury and ambition. To fully grasp the scale of Ragnar Lothbrok, real or fictional, we must first immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of the world that birthed him, the mid-9th century. This was a Europe of feuding kingdoms, still reeling from the collapse of Charlemagne's colossal empire. His heirs, like vultures, tore the great legacy to pieces, mired in infighting and dynastic disputes. West Francia, under Charles the Bald, was rich but vulnerable, its long, slow rivers leading like veins into the heart of the country, perfect pathways for those who came not to trade, but to raid. In the British Isles, the situation was even more chaotic. The Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy, 7 kingdoms in constant conflict, was a mosaic of ambition and betrayal. Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, each was too consumed by infighting to notice the storm gathering from the north. Their wealth, concentrated in defenseless monasteries filled with gold, silver, and precious manuscripts, was a ripe fruit waiting for its harvester. And in the north, in Scandinavia, a demographic and social explosion was brewing. Land was scarce, but young, strong, and ambitious warriors, raised on tales of heroes and gods, were abundant. For them, there were only 2 paths: die in obscurity on a rocky patch of land, or take up the axe and the oar to forge their destiny in fire and blood on foreign shores. Their ships, the Drakkar, were the technological marvel of the age, fast, with a shallow draft, able to sail up rivers and appear where no one expected them. The young, fierce blood of Scandinavia was boiling, waiting for great deeds, and this boiling pot needed only one man whose name would become a banner to lead them. The world was on the threshold of the Viking Age, and it did not yet know what awaited it. In the heart of this simmering Scandinavian world, where reality was tightly woven with myth, the legend of Ragnar's origin is born. The sagas, written centuries after his supposed life, do not skimp on epic details. creating a truly divine lineage for their hero. According to the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, he was the son of the Swedish king Sigurd Ring, victor of the legendary Battle of Bravelir, and his ancestry, through many generations of heroic ancestors, traced back to the chief god of war and wisdom himself, Odin. This, even if pure fiction, was immensely important. In a pagan world where blood and origin defined a man's status and destiny, to be descended from a god meant possessing an innate right to power and glory. This didn't just make him an aristocrat, it placed him above other kings, turning him into a living embodiment of divine will. Such a genealogy was a powerful propaganda tool. It inspired his warriors to believe they were following not just a lucky chieftain, but a chosen one of fate, destined to do great things. To his enemies, it inspired superstitious terror. How can you stand against one in whose veins flows the blood of the All-Father? This mythologizing of a person was a key element of Viking culture. The skalds, the court poets, were not just storytellers. They were image makers, creating and maintaining the reputation of their patrons. By composing poems about Ragnar's divine origin, they turned his name into a brand, a symbol of indestructible power. And this brand would prove so strong that it would outlive the man himself, becoming the foundation for his son's great conquests and the justification for their unseen cruelty. Thus, even before Ragnar launched his first raid, he was already an epic hero, a figure woven from prophecy and divine heritage, and this legend would become his most formidable weapon. Fate, as the Norse believed, is woven by the Norns at the roots of the world tree Yggdrasil, and the thread of Ragnar's life, according to the sagas, was woven into a pattern of great prophecies from the very beginning. The key moment that defined his future and the future of all of Europe was his meeting with Aslaug, a woman of unearthly beauty and mysterious origin. When Ragnar's men found her, she was living with a poor Norwegian family, hiding her true identity under the name Kraka and concealing her beautiful hair under a layer of tar. But Ragnar, known for his insight, suspected she was something more. To test her mind, he gave her a riddle: to come to him, neither clothed nor unclothed, neither hungry nor fed, neither alone nor with company. Aslaug, showing extraordinary wisdom, arrived wrapped in a fishing net, biting an onion and accompanied by a dog. With this, she proved her mind was equal to her beauty. Her secret was soon revealed. She was the daughter of the legendary hero Sigurd, killer of the dragon Fafnir, and the Valkyrie Brynhildr. This union of Ragnar, descendant of Odin, with the daughter of the greatest hero of the Germanic Norse epic, was not just a marriage, it was the merging of two powerful mythological lines. It was from this union, as the prophecy foretold, that sons would be born whose names would inspire dread across the world. Aslaug predicted that their first son, if they were not patient on their wedding night, would be born with a deformity, but his mind would be sharper than any blade. Thus, Ivar the Boneless was born. He was followed by others: Björn Ironside, Hvitserk, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye, who got his name from a mark in his eye resembling a snake biting its own tail, an ancient symbol of eternity and fate. This prophecy of his sons became the central element of Ragnar's entire saga. It turned his life from a mere series of raids into a prologue for an even greater story: the story of his heirs, their destined glory, their future conquests, and, most importantly, their vengeance for their father. All of it was foretold, creating a sense of epic inevitability and turning Ragnar into the founding patriarch of the greatest Viking dynasty. Before Ragnar Lothbrok became the terror of Europe, he first had to forge his name and reputation at home, in the crucible of Scandinavian legends and infighting. The sagas paint his early years as a series of exploits, demonstrating not only his martial prowess, but also the extraordinary intellect and charisma that set him apart from hundreds of other ambitious Vikings. One of his first and most famous exploits was the defeat of a monstrous serpent that guarded the beautiful Thora Borgarhjort, daughter of the Jarl of Götaland. The Jarl had promised his daughter's hand to any man who could rid his lands of the monster. While other warriors relied on strength alone, Ragnar approached the task with cunning. He ordered special trousers and a cloak made of rough wool and had them boiled in pitch. This improvised armor, which became as hard as stone, protected him from the serpent's venomous fangs, allowing him to get close and strike the beast with his spear. It was for these tarred trousers, according to legend, that he earned his famous nickname, Lothbrok, meaning hairy breeches, or leather breeches. This deed is important not just as a display of courage, but as a symbol of his modus operandi. Ragnar always seeks unconventional solutions, using his wits where strength alone is not enough. Another key episode in his rise was his marriage to the legendary shield maiden, Lagertha. Meeting her in battle, he was struck by her ferocity and skill as a warrior. She fought in the front ranks, and, as Saxo Grammaticus says, though a maiden, she had the courage of a man. To win her, Ragnar had to defeat a bear and a great hound that guarded her home. This union, though brief, further strengthened his reputation, linking his name with the image of a powerful warrior woman. These early stories, whether true or fictional, served a vital function. They created the image of the ideal Viking hero. He was not just a ruthless berserker, but a multifaceted character, a cunning strategist, a slayer of monsters, and a lover of beautiful and strong women. This reputation, forged in the smithy of myth, became the foundation upon which he would build his empire of fear and glory. Although the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, describing the chilling raid on the monastery of St. Cuthbert on the Isle of Lindisfarne in 793, do not name the leader of the Northmen, this day is forever marked in history as the symbolic start of the Viking Age. In our narrative, this act of unholy violence becomes Ragnar Lothbrok's first blood spilled on foreign soil, his loud announcement of himself to the world. Let us picture the scene, a quiet, misty June day. Monks, suspecting nothing, go about their peaceful lives, full of prayer and the copying of sacred texts. And suddenly, from the milky fog, silent as ghosts, the Drakkar ships with their terrifying carved heads emerge onto the sandy shore. To the monks, it was an apparition from the apocalypse. Long-haired, bearded giants with axes and round shields, speaking a guttural, unknown tongue, burst into the sanctuary with the fury the Christian world hadn't yet seen. The clash of swords mixed with death cries and the crackle of breaking altars. The Vikings felt no piety for Christian holy sites. For them, crucifixes, chalices, and reliquaries were just gold and silver to be melted down. They murdered the monks, threw them into the sea, or took them as slaves. The scholar Alcuin at the court of Charlemagne wrote to his king, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain. The heathen have desecrated God's sanctuary, shed the blood of saints around the altar, destroyed the house of our hope, and trampled the bodies of saints like dung in the street." This raid was not just robbery, it was an act of psychological warfare. It struck at the very heart of Christian faith and culture, showing that no place was safe from the fury of the Northmen. For Ragnar, in our story, this was not just a quest for wealth, it was the first step toward immortal glory. He saw the vulnerability of this rich but divided world, and understood that for a man bold and ruthless enough, everything was here for the taking. The smoke over the ruins of Lindisfarne was a signal fire, heralding the dawn of a new era, an era in which the name Ragnar Lothbrok would be synonymous with fear and destruction. To understand the trajectory of Ragnar Lothbrok's life, we must look into the core of his soul, into the unquenchable fire that pushed him further and further, beyond the limits of the known world. And that fire was fed not so much by a lust for gold or power in the traditional sense, but by one all-consuming passion, the thirst for glory. In Viking culture, where there was no concept of a Christian paradise and a valiant death in battle led to Valhalla, the greatest achievement for a man was to leave behind a name that would be remembered for centuries. Wealth could be lost, lands could be taken, but a story told by a skald at a fireside, a song of great deeds that was eternal. This immortality, in the memory of descendants, was the true currency for which Ragnar was willing to pay any price. He saw how quickly the names of ordinary kings were forgotten, their lives reduced to petty squabbles and seasonal raids on neighbors. His ambition was far grander. He didn't just want to be the richest. He wanted to do something so daring, so unheard of, that his name would be forever etched into the fabric of history. Every campaign he led was a calculated act of self-promotion. The attack on Paris, the heart of Christian Europe, was not just a raid. It was a challenge thrown at the most powerful kingdom of the time. The legend of him feigning death to infiltrate the city is not a story about tactics, but about brilliant PR, creating an image of an unpredictable and supernaturally cunning enemy. This inner demon, this insatiable need for glory, explains many of his seemingly irrational actions. He risked everything, not for survival, but for a great story. And it is this character trait, this obsession with his own narrative, that makes the paradox of his death even more profound. For a man who spent his whole life building his legend, the most important part of that legend, its finale, had to be flawless. And if reality didn't provide him with a sufficiently dramatic end, it would be perfectly natural for a man like Ragnar to invent one. His final fatal voyage to England with only 2 ships is not the act of a madman. It is the act of an actor, stepping onto the stage for his final, most memorable monologue, knowing that this is what will grant him entry into history. Ragnar Lothbrok's power lay not just in his personal skill or tactical genius, but in the tool he perfected, the Drakkar, and in how he turned his fleet from a simple means of transport into a powerful weapon of psychological warfare. The Drakkar, or dragon ship, was the pinnacle of engineering of its time. Its long, narrow, and flexible hull, built using clinker technology, overlapping planks, allowed it to literally glide over the waves, making it incredibly fast and maneuverable. Its shallow draft gave the Vikings a strategic advantage their enemies could not dream of. They could not only cross the open sea, but also enter river estuaries, sailing hundreds of miles inland, attacking cities that were considered completely invulnerable from the sea, like Paris, Hamburg, or Nantes. This completely changed the rules of war. European armies were slow, focused on land battles and sieges. The Viking fleet was the embodiment of speed and surprise. They appeared from nowhere, struck, and vanished with their loot before local lords could even muster a defense. But Ragnar understood that the Drakkar was more than just an efficient transport. He made it a symbol of terror. Picture the scene. From the morning fog on the Seine or the Thames, without a sound except the creak of oarlocks and the splash of oars, not 1 or 2, but 100 of these ships emerge. On the prow of each, a carved, fiercely grinning head of a dragon or sea serpent, painted in bright colors. Round shields of warriors hang along the sides, and a banner bearing Odin's raven flutters in the wind. The sight alone paralyzed the will to resist before the battle even began. This was not just an army invading. It was an invasion of monsters from pagan myths, a nightmare come to life. Ragnar used this fear masterfully. He coordinated his fleet's actions, striking multiple places at once, creating the illusion that his warriors were far more numerous than they actually were. He turned the rivers of Europe into his personal highways, and his fleet into a legend. The fame of Ragnar's dragon ships flew ahead of them, and the mere news of their approach made coastal city dwellers flee in panic, abandoning all their possessions. Thus, even before the first Viking axe touched a city's gates, the battle was already half won. The height of Ragnar Lothbrok's military career, the moment that transformed him from a successful raider into a figure of global significance, was the brazen siege and sacking of Paris in 845. This event was a slap in the face to the entire Christian world and demonstrated the extreme vulnerability of even the most powerful European states to the new threat from the north. Ragnar's fleet, numbering, according to eyewitnesses, 120 ships and about 5,000 warriors, entered the mouth of the Seine and began its relentless advance toward the heart of West Francia. Along the way, the Vikings sowed death and destruction, burning cities like Rouen and ruthlessly dealing with any resistance. King Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, tried to organize a defense, splitting his army in two on opposite banks of the Seine. This was a fatal mistake. Ragnar, ignoring one part of the Frankish army, fell upon the other with his full might, crushing it while their comrades watched helplessly from the other side. As an act of terror, he ordered 111 Frankish prisoners to be hanged on a small island in the Seine, dedicating them to Odin. This brutal ritual shattered the defenders' morale. On March 28th, Easter Sunday, the Vikings entered Paris, which had been abandoned by most of its inhabitants. They plundered the churches and monasteries, including the wealthy Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, taking countless treasures. Charles the Bald, lacking the strength to drive the invaders from his capital, was forced into an unprecedented humiliation. He paid Ragnar an enormous ransom, a danegeld, of 7,000 pounds of silver and gold, equal to about 2.5 tons of precious metals. This was not just a payment. It was a tribute, an admission of powerlessness. The capture of Paris had colossal consequences. It not only enriched Ragnar and his men, but also turned his name into a legend across Europe. He was the man who had brought the heir of Charlemagne to his knees. This triumph also set a dangerous precedent. It showed other Viking leaders that blackmail and terror were extremely profitable strategies. From then on, raids would become even larger and more organized. For Ragnar himself, Paris was the pinnacle of his glory, the moment when he perhaps came to believe in his own absolute invincibility and divine favor. In the annals of military cunning, few stories can compare to the one attributed to Ragnar Lothbrok during his campaigns in the Frankish lands. While the siege of Paris in 845 was the peak of his overt military power, another semi-mythical story, told by chroniclers, illustrates his second, equally formidable aspect: the master of deception and psychological manipulation. According to this legend, faced with the impregnable walls of a Frankish city, Ragnar realized a direct assault would only lead to massive losses. He then resorted to a tactic worthy of Odysseus himself. He ordered his men to spread a rumor that their leader was mortally ill and, repenting his sins, wished to convert to Christianity before he died and be buried with Christian rites inside the city walls. This news was met with jubilation by the townspeople and clergy. The conversion of the greatest pagan chieftain seemed like a true miracle, a triumph for their god. A delegation of priests was sent to the Viking camp, where they found Ragnar on his deathbed, surrounded by his grieving warriors. He appeared weak and repentant, humbly begging for the last rites. No one suspected a trick. The next day, a casket, supposedly containing Ragnar's body, was solemnly carried through the city gates. It was followed by a small, seemingly unarmed procession of his closest comrades, permitted to attend the funeral mass in the main cathedral. And at the moment the casket was in the heart of the city, the lid flew open, and out leaped Ragnar Lothbrok, alive and full of fury, sword in hand. His warriors, who had hidden weapons under their cloaks, instantly enacted the second part of the plan. A massacre began. The gates were opened from the inside, and the main Viking army poured into the defenseless city. This story, regardless of its historical accuracy, is a perfect metaphor for Ragnar's tactics. He fought not only with the sword, but with his mind, using the prejudices, beliefs, and arrogance of his enemies against them. He was a master of asymmetric warfare, understanding that fear, surprise, and deception could be far more devastating than the sharpest axe. The legend of the Trojan casket became an integral part of his image, transforming him from a mere barbarian conqueror into a genius of cunning, a figure akin to the Norse trickster god, Loki. Central to Ragnar's saga are his relationships with his sons, figures as legendary as he was. They were simultaneously his greatest strength and a potential threat, his legacy and his rivals. Bjorn Ironside, his son with Lagertha or Thora, was the epitome of the classic Viking hero. A courageous navigator and warrior whose expeditions extended all the way to the Mediterranean, where he famously plundered Italian cities. Ivar the Boneless, Aslag's son, was his complete opposite. Deprived of the ability to fight on his own 2 feet, he possessed a brilliant but cruel strategic mind, seeing the world as a chessboard and people as pawns in his game. Sigurd's snake in the eye, whose strange mark in his eye seemed to foretell a special destiny from birth, was more pensive and enigmatic. Together with their other brothers, like Hvitserk and Ubba, they formed a new generation of Vikings, raised in the colossal shadow of their father's glory. While Ragnar was alive, his authority held their ambitions in check, uniting them under his banner. However, as his sons became celebrated chieftains in their own right, tension inevitably grew. They strove to surpass their father, to prove they were not just the old boar's piglets, but independent forces capable of forging their own empires. This dynamic, admiration mixed with rivalry, is the key to understanding the events that followed. On the other end of this drama stood the saga's main antagonist, Ella, King of Northumbria. In the sagas, he is portrayed as an arrogant, cruel, and short-sighted ruler. Historically, Ella was a real figure, a usurper who seized the Northumbrian throne around 862, during a period of deep internal crisis for that kingdom. For the saga authors, he became the perfect villain. His vanity prevented him from appreciating the scale of the threat Ragnar posed, even as a prisoner, and his cruelty in choosing the execution method, the snake pit, became the ideal catalyst for revenge. Thus, the key pieces were set on the board of history. An aging lion father, hungry for one last triumph, his young, ambitious cubs ready to inherit the pride, and a short-sighted king, destined to play the role of executioner and the next victim. A clash between these forces was inevitable, and it would change the history of the British Isles forever. The most enigmatic and perhaps most important act of Ragnar Lothbrok's life is his decision to embark on his final voyage to England. According to the sagas, in his advanced years and possessing immense wealth and glory, he suddenly decided to do something unheard of. He announced he would conquer England with only 2 ships, declaring that great deeds are done not by numbers, but by courage. His wife, Aslog, begged him to reconsider, warning him that his ships were not built for the harsh waters of the North Sea, and that doom awaited him. But Ragnar was adamant. This act seems completely irrational, contradicting everything we know about him as a calculating strategist. Why would a man who assembled a fleet of over 100 ships to attack Paris suddenly decide to challenge an entire Anglo-Saxon kingdom with a handful of warriors? The answer lies in psychology and in the very thirst for glory that had driven him his whole life. Perhaps it was an act of supreme pride, or hubris, as the ancient Greeks called it. Having reached the pinnacle, Ragnar may have come to believe in his own divine invincibility, in the idea that his reputation alone could crush his enemies. He wanted to prove to everyone, and most of all to himself, that his name carried more weight than thousands of warriors. Another, darker interpretation is that the aging Ragnar saw the star of his sons rising. Their exploits were eclipsing his own, and he may have felt like a fading era. This last voyage may have been a desperate attempt to reclaim the spotlight, to perform a feat that none of his sons could replicate, or perhaps a conscious search for a glorious death. In Viking culture, dying of old age in one's bed was considered a disgrace. Death in battle, weapon in hand, was the only worthy end for a warrior. By sailing to England with 2 ships, Ragnar practically guaranteed himself such an outcome. He wasn't just taking a risk, he was walking toward his destiny, seeking to direct his own grand finale. This moment of choice, this irrational decision, becomes the turning point of the entire saga. It sets in motion the chain of events that will lead to his capture, his legendary execution, and ultimately, the invasion of the great heathen army. This was not just a military campaign. It was a ritual act, a final throw of the dice in a game with the Norns, and the stake in this game was immortality. At the peak of his power, Ragnar Lothbrok ceased to be just a man. He became a living myth, a figure whose shadow fell across all of Europe. After humiliating the Frankish king and engaging in decades of successful raids, he likely began to believe his own legend, his divine origin, and the protection of Odin. This moment of supreme triumph often becomes the harbinger of a fall, for it is then that the poison of pride, hubris, seeps into the hero's soul. Ragnar, standing at the top of the world, looked at his sons, who were themselves becoming great chieftains, and perhaps felt a sting of jealousy. He heard the songs of the Skalds, which now praised not only him, but also Björn, returned from the Mediterranean, and Ivar, whose cruel wisdom inspired fear. And so, a daring, suicidal plan is born in his mind. He is not just challenging King Ella, he is challenging fate itself. The phrase the sagas put in his mouth, "I will conquer England with 2 ships," is the essence of his pride. He no longer needs armies. His name is his army. He disregards all rational arguments, all signs and prophecies. His wife, Aslaug, who possesses the gift of foresight, weaves him a magical shirt that no weapon can pierce, yet at the same time begs him not to go, predicting catastrophe. He accepts the gift, but rejects the warning. This moment is a classic tragic motif. The hero, blinded by his past successes, considers himself equal to the gods and commits the fatal act that sets the mechanism of his doom in motion. In setting out for Northumbria, Ragnar is not behaving like a general, but like an epic hero, consciously walking toward his predestined, glorious fate. He wants his end to be as loud as his life. He does not wish to fade into the shadow of his sons. He wants to go out in a flash of lightning, leaving behind a legend that will inspire them to even greater deeds. This pride, this desire to control his own narrative to the very end, becomes the force that pushes him straight into the hands of King Ella, and consequently into the mythical snake pit. He himself is writing the final act of his drama, and the price for this act will be paid in the blood of an entire generation. It is at this very moment, as the myth of Ragnar reaches its zenith, that we must take a step back and listen to the quiet, insistent voice of history. And this voice tells us something completely different. When we begin to study contemporary written sources, Anglo-Saxon, Frankish, and Irish chronicles from the 9th century, we are met with a deafening silence. The name Ragnar Lothbrok is almost never found in them. The Frankish annals mention the leader of the Vikings who besieged Paris in 845 as Ragnar. Many historians consider him one of the prototypes for Ragnar. However, these same chronicles report that after receiving his ransom, Ragnar and his army were struck by an epidemic of dysentery, from which the leader himself died. There is no glorious voyage to England, no King Ella, no snake pit. Other sources, the Irish annals, speak of a powerful Viking chieftain named Thorgils, who terrorized Ireland and was killed in 845, and of a certain Ivar, founder of a dynasty of rulers in Dublin. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, while detailing the arrival of the great heathen army in 865 and its leaders, Ivar, Ubba, and Halfdan, makes no mention whatsoever that they came to avenge a father named Ragnar. This glaring discrepancy between the rich, detailed saga and the sparse, silent chronicles has given rise to the main historical hypothesis. Ragnar Lothbrok was likely not a single historical person. He is probably a composite figure, a literary construct in whom the deeds and fates of several real Viking chieftains were merged. The skalds and saga authors, writing their works 300 to 400 years after the events, took scattered stories about the campaigns of Ragnar, the exploits of Ivar's sons, and other heroes, and combined them into one grand, cohesive biography, creating the ideal Viking hero. These first cracks in the monolith of the legend force us to ask the main question. If Ragnar as a single person perhaps never existed, then who died in the snake pit? And why was this story invented in the first place? Regardless of whether Ragnar was a real man or a myth, the saga continues its relentless drive toward a tragic conclusion. Having rejected all warnings, he sets out on his final voyage. His 2 ships, magnificently built, but not intended for the fury of the North Sea, are caught in a vicious storm off the coast of Northumbria. The mighty waves, like the hands of enraged sea gods, hurl the Drakkar onto the coastal rocks, shattering them to splinters. Ragnar and a handful of his surviving warriors are cast ashore on an enemy beach. This moment, the shipwreck, is deeply symbolic. Ragnar Lothbrok, whose power and glory were inextricably linked to his fleet, to his dragons, is suddenly stripped of his main weapon and attribute of power. He is like a sea god cast ashore, his power lost. From the fearsome conqueror who terrified entire kingdoms, he is reduced to a mere mortal, soaked, exhausted, with a small band of men in a hostile foreign land. He's no longer the hunter, but the hunted. He tries to fight his way inland, but the forces are too uneven. News of the shipwreck and the appearance of Vikings quickly reaches King Ella. He gathers his army and marches out to meet the invaders. In the ensuing battle, Ragnar's small band fights with the fury of the doomed, but they are, predictably, crushed. Ragnar himself, protected by Aslaug's magic shirt, which no weapon can pierce, fights like a lion, but is eventually overwhelmed by numbers and taken captive. This fatal act, the shipwreck, becomes the point of no return. It strips Ragnar of control over his own destiny and delivers him into the hands of his sworn enemy. All his cunning, all his tactical genius, proves useless against the power of the elements and a superior enemy force. The legend of the great warrior approaches its final, darkest act. and the stage for his mythical death is set. The capture of Ragnar Lothbrok presents King Ella with a complex dilemma and sets up one of the most tense scenes in the entire saga. The Northumbrian ruler, who in real history was just one of many Anglo-Saxon kings fighting for power, suddenly finds himself in possession of a figure of mythical proportions. For Ella, this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance, an opportunity to go down in history as the man who defeated the greatest Viking of the age. But with this came an enormous responsibility. What to do with such a prisoner? A simple, quick execution, like beheading, would not be enough. It would not match the status of the victim, nor would it bring Ella the glory he craved. Moreover, it might be seen as a sign of respect, a worthy death for a warrior, which was the last thing the hate-filled and fearful Ella wanted. He wanted not just to kill Ragnar, he wanted to humiliate him, to break his spirit, to show the whole world that the pagan demon terrorizing Christendom was merely a mortal man. On the other hand, showing mercy or trying to ransom Ragnar would be seen as weakness. It would only whet the appetites of his sons and other Vikings. Ella was trapped. Any standard solution was either insufficient or too risky. And so, according to the saga, he devises an special execution, one intended to be as horrific and unusual as his prisoner's crimes. He orders Ragnar to be thrown into a pit teeming with venomous snakes. In the context of the saga, this choice of execution is perfectly logical. The serpent, in both Norse and Christian mythology, is a symbol of chthonic terror, of primordial evil. One need only recall the serpent, Jormungandr, or the biblical tempter. By throwing Ragnar into the snake pit, Ella is not just killing him. He is performing a symbolic act, casting his enemy into the depths, into the embrace of dark forces. He is attempting to stage a theater of cruelty, designed to demonstrate his absolute power and the triumph of a Christian king over a pagan monster. However, he failed to consider one thing. For a master of self-presentation like Ragnar, any stage, even the stage of his own death, is an opportunity for a final, immortal performance. The snake pit. It is not a place of execution. It is a stage upon which Ragnar Lothbrok delivers his immortal monologue, turning his own defeat into his greatest victory. When he is cast into the pit, the saga tells us he shows neither fear nor despair. He knows his physical life is over, but his true life, his life in legend, is just beginning. Every gesture, every word in these final moments is a carefully crafted message, addressed not to his executioners, but to future generations. He stands among the hissing vipers, and looking death in the face, he laughs. He recounts his past victories, the rivers of blood he shed in Odin's name, the 51 battles in which he led his warriors. He does this not to boast, but to remind the world who he was, and to create a heroic context for his death. He transforms his execution from a shameful end into the glorious conclusion of a great warrior's journey, ready to meet his fate. And then he delivers his famous line, "How the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. Gnidja mundu grisir, ef galtar hag visi." In these words lies the essence of his genius. This is not just a metaphor, with him as the boar and his sons as the piglets. It is a perfectly crafted declaration of war, a testament of vengeance. He is not asking his sons to avenge him, he is stating it as a fact. Their vengeance will be as inevitable and furious as the squealing of pigs who learn of their father's demise. With this one sentence, he transforms King Ella from a victor into the trigger for a far more terrible event. He robs Illa of his triumph, showing him that his death is not an end, but a beginning. He is programming the future, setting in motion the mechanism that will lead to the invasion of the great heathen army and the death of Ella himself. Thus, in his final hour, Ragnar achieves his greatest victory. He dies on his own terms, turning his execution into a catalyst for vengeance on an epic scale and ensuring his own immortality in the songs of the Skalds. The snake pit ceases to be his place of humiliation and becomes the pedestal for his eternal glory. News of Ragnar's death spreads like wildfire through the Scandinavian world, and how his sons receive it becomes one of the most dramatic and psychologically astute scenes in the saga. King Ella's messenger, arriving to triumphantly announce their father's execution, finds the sons at different activities. Bjorn Ironside is playing Hnefatafl, a Norse board game, with such self-control that upon hearing the news, he merely grips a game piece so tightly that his fingerprints are impressed upon it. Sigurd Snake in the Eye, who is trimming his nails with a knife, listens to the messenger with an impassive face and slowly pushes the knife into his own finger until it hits the bone. But he does not even wince. However, the most frightening reaction is from Ivar the Boneless. He sits apart and demands the messenger tell him everything, in the smallest detail. He asks about his father's every word, every gesture. His face, usually contorted, remains perfectly calm, almost indifferent. But as the story is told, his face changes color, now pale, now red, now blue, betraying the storm raging within him. This contrast in the brothers' reactions reveals their characters. Bjorn and Sigurd display the stoic composure of a warrior, hiding their rage and grief beneath a mask of impassivity. But Ivar, the strategist and brain of the family, understands that simple emotions are useless here. He immediately begins to analyze the situation. He realizes that their father's death, so theatrical and cruel, is not just a tragedy. It is a casus belli, a perfect pretext for war, a gift of fate. He understands that this story, of an unbowed hero who laughed in the face of death and foretold his own vengeance, can become a banner capable of uniting thousands of warriors from all over Scandinavia. And it is Ivar, the saga says, who becomes the chief architect of the vengeance. He holds back his brother's hot heads, calling not for an immediate raid, but for careful preparation. He understands that to avenge a figure as great as Ragnar, they need not just a punitive expedition, but the greatest army the northern world has ever seen. Thus begins the gathering of the great heathen army, and the news of Ragnar's death becomes not a funeral knell, but a battle horn, calling them to a holy war. Ragnar Lothbrok's death, whatever its reality, became the ideological fuel in the saga's mythical space that ignited the flames of an invasion of unprecedented scale. The legend of his martyrdom became a powerful propaganda tool, a banner under which his sons managed to gather and unite forces that had previously seemed incompatible. In 865, an armada approached the shores of East Anglia, an army that Anglo-Saxon chronicles would call, in terror, the Mysel Hethen here, the great heathen army. This was something entirely new. Previous Viking raids had been seasonal, their goal being plunder. This army, however, had come to stay. It was composed of thousands of warriors from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, united by the single purpose articulated in the sagas: vengeance for Ragnar. The name of their martyred father became their battle cry. It transformed ordinary raiders and mercenaries into warriors of a holy war, dispensers of justice. Every warrior who joined the army felt himself a participant in a great drama, the executor of a legendary hero's final will. This ideological fervor gave them a fury and resilience that their opponents lacked. For the Anglo-Saxon kings, it was just another barbarian invasion. For the Vikings, It was a personal vendetta of epic proportions. Under the leadership of Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, the army operated with unprecedented cruelty and efficiency. They no longer made quick raids from the coast. They seized horses and transformed into a mobile land force that could strike at the very heart of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. They acted not chaotically, but according to a unified strategic plan, one devised, as legend holds, by the brilliant mind of Ivar. The myth of Ragnar was their chief intangible asset. It justified their conquests, legitimized their rule over captured territories, and unified a diverse army, preventing internal strife. They had not come just for land and gold. They had come to restore justice as they understood it. And this powerful narrative proved to be a far more devastating weapon than their axes and swords. The culmination of the sun's vengeance and the darkest act of the entire saga was the revenge on King Ella. After the great heathen army had conquered and ravaged most of Northumbria, including its capital, York, Ella, according to legend, was finally captured. For him, there could be no simple and quick death. The revenge had to mirror his own crime. It had to be just as cruel, theatrical, and symbolic. Ragnar's sons, with Ivar at the forefront, sentenced him to the most gruesome ritual execution known in the Scandinavian world, the blood eagle, bloodurn. This ritual, described in sagas and skaldic poetry, was an act of inhuman cruelty. The victim, while still alive, would have the skin and muscles on their back cut along the spine. The ribs were then broken and pulled outward, creating the likeness of wings. Finally, the lungs were pulled out through the opening and laid over the shoulders, like the wings of a giant bird. The victim's final breath, as air filled the spread-out lungs, was said to resemble the flapping of an eagle's wings. For the Vikings, this was not just torture. It was a supreme sacrifice to Odin, the god of war, who was often accompanied by ravens and eagles feasting on the battlefield dead. By performing this ritual on Ella, Ragnar's sons were not just killing him, they were dedicating him to their chief god, turning their vengeance into a sacred act. However, like the snake pit, the historicity of the blood eagle is fiercely debated among scholars. There is not a single mention of its use in contemporary chronicles. Many historians believe the blood eagle may be the result of a mistranslation of complex skaldic poetry, or perhaps a literary exaggeration created by later saga authors to add more drama and horror to their tales. But, as with Ragnar's death, the historical truth is less important than the power of the myth. The legend of the blood eagle for King Ella became the perfect, symmetrical ending to the story of vengeance. Cruelty had birthed an even greater cruelty, and the circle of violence closed in the most horrific way imaginable. Now that we have seen the grand drama of the saga unfold, it is time to return to the cold, uncomfortable world of historical fact and finally deconstruct the myth. As mentioned, Frankish chronicles report the death of Ragnar's prototype, Reginerus, from disease after the siege of Paris in 845. This is a prosaic death, devoid of any heroism, and could never have been the basis for a great legend. Other versions exist. Some Icelandic sources, closer to historical reality than the heroic sagas, suggest Ragnar may have been killed during a raid on the coast of the Irish Sea. The Irish annals, in turn, are full of stories about Viking chieftains with similar names who met their end in countless skirmishes on the Emerald Isle. None of these sources say a word about Northumbria, King Ella, or a snake pit. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the most important document for English history of that period, details the conquests of the great heathen army, but is completely silent about the reason for its arrival. The idea that it was an act of vengeance for Ragnar only appears in sources 2 centuries later, when oral traditions began to be written down. So where did this incredibly vivid and memorable story of the snake pit come from? Historians suggest its roots may lie in even older Germanic legends. There is a poem in the Poetic Edda about the hero Gunnar, who was thrown into a snake pit by King Attila, and, in his final moments, played the harp, charming the vipers. It is likely that the saga authors, seeking to create a truly epic ending for their hero Ragnar, simply borrowed this powerful literary motif from the ancient epic treasury, adapting it for their own story. The truth turns out to be far more mundane and confusing. There was probably no single Ragnar, no single death. There were several chieftains whose fates and deeds merged into a single stream, which talented storytellers then channeled into the riverbed of a great but fictional tragedy. If the story of Ragnar's death in the snake pit is a fabrication, then the main question arises: who needed it, and why? The answer is simple. This beautiful lie was a brilliant act of political propaganda, a 9th century PR campaign created to justify and legitimize the Viking conquests in England. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of Ivar, Halfdan, and the other leaders of the great heathen army. They came to England, not just to plunder, they came to seize lands and found their own kingdoms. But to do this, they needed an ideological justification that would unite their diverse army and give their actions a veneer of justice in the eyes of their own people. It is one thing to be mere invaders and occupiers. It is another entirely to be avengers, fulfilling a sacred duty to their murdered father, a legendary hero. The legend of Ragnar and his martyrdom at the hands of King Ella solved several problems at once. First, it created a common enemy and a common goal, uniting warriors from different lands under a single banner. Second, it demonized the opponent, portraying the Anglo-Saxon king as a treacherous and cruel tyrant who deserved the most terrible punishment. Third, it gave the conquest a sacred, almost religious character. This was not just a war for territory, it was a vendetta, blessed by the gods themselves. By conquering Northumbria and killing Ella, Ragnar's sons weren't just expanding their domains, they were restoring justice. This story became their mandate for conquest. They were not usurpers, but rightful heirs, come to take what was theirs by right of blood and vengeance. The myth of Ragnar became the legal and moral foundation for the creation of a Scandinavian kingdom in the heart of England, which would later be known as the Danelaw, the territory under Danish law. Thus, the beautiful lie about a hero's death turned out to be a more valuable asset than any army or fleet. It was a weapon that struck not at bodies, but at minds, transforming a bloody invasion into a noble epic. To understand how scattered rumors, half-forgotten exploits, and outright fabrications were forged into the coherent and compelling biography of Ragnar Lothbrok, we must look to the true creators of this story, the Skalds and the later saga authors. In Viking society, the Skald was not just a poet. He was the keeper of memory, a historian, and a propagandist, all in one. His art, complex alliterative poetry, full of intricate metaphors called kennings, was the primary mass media of the age. It was the Skalds, in the service of kings and jarls, who composed praise poems, drapas, about their patrons' exploits, securing for them the very glory that every Viking craved. The first oral tales of Ragnar and his sons probably began to form in the 9th and 10th centuries, passed down by word of mouth, growing more fantastic with each new telling. However, these stories took their final, canonical form much later, in the 12th and 13th centuries, in Iceland. It was there, in a unique cultural environment, where Christianity had not yet fully displaced pagan heritage, and the love for ancient lore was incredibly strong. that unknown authors wrote down the great family sagas, including the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and the tale of Ragnar's sons. Authors like the great Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson or the Danish chronicler Saxo Grammaticus, who included a detailed history of Ragnar in his Gesta Danorum, Deeds of the Danes, were not just scribes. They were writers of immense literary talent. They took scattered oral traditions, fragments of skaldic poetry, and motifs from ancient Germanic epics, and wove them into thrilling, psychologically believable, and dramatically sound narratives. They were the screenwriters of history. They were less concerned with documentary accuracy than with creating a vivid, instructive, and inspiring image of a hero. They cut away everything boring and prosaic, like dying of dysentery, and amplified everything heroic and tragic. It was their literary genius that transformed a vague, contradictory figure, or figures, into the immortal character we know today. In the end, in the centuries-long battle for a place in history, the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok won a crushing victory over the boring and ambiguous historical truth. The reason for this victory is simple. The fictional story of his death in a snake pit was immeasurably better, stronger, and more useful from a dramatic and ideological standpoint. The historical truth is a tangled mess of contradictory sources, unconfirmed hypotheses, and prosaic events. Death by dysentery, death in a random skirmish in Ireland, or simply disappearing from the chronicles. None of these is a fitting end for a great hero. Such an end cannot inspire vengeance. It cannot form the basis of a national epic. The legend, however, offers a perfect, complete story. It has all the components of great drama: a charismatic hero, his fatal flaw, hubris, a cunning villain, a tragic but heroic death, and finally, a grand finale of just and bloody retribution. This story possesses an emotional power that dry historical fact lacks. It evokes empathy, anger, and admiration. It teaches us how to meet death, how important loyalty to one's kin is, and how inevitable retribution is for evil deeds. This story was so good that it completely displaced all other versions, becoming the sole truth for subsequent generations. People have always preferred a great lie to a boring truth, especially if that lie affirmed their values and justified their actions. The myth of Ragnar became a cultural code, a part of the identity of the Scandinavian peoples. And when the Romantic era in the 19th century revived interest in the Vikings, it was this vivid, heroic image that was adopted, not the image of the real, far more pragmatic, and often less heroic sea raiders. Thus, Ragnar Lothbrok defeated history because his legend answered a deep human need for grand narratives, for stories of heroes who are larger than life and whose deaths have meaning. And so, we arrive at the resolution of the main paradox laid out in our story. Ragnar Lothbrok is immortal not because he was a great warrior or king, but because he transformed into something much greater, an idea, an eternal archetype. The historical man or men behind the name has long since dissolved in the mists of time, his bones turned to dust, his real deeds forgotten. But the idea of Ragnar, the idea of absolute freedom, of a brazen challenge to the established order, of defiance in the face of all authority, be it a king or death itself, has proven to be incorruptible. Ragnar is the embodiment of the Viking spirit in its most romanticized form. He is not just a raider, he is an explorer, a pioneer, challenging both sea storms and powerful empires. He is a trickster, using his wits and cunning where strength alone is useless. He is a pagan, looking on with a smirk at the dogmas and relics of the Christian world. He is a father whose name becomes a banner for his sons. And finally, he is a philosopher, meeting death not with terror, but with curiosity and defiance. The real biography of this character is completely unimportant, because his function in culture is to be a symbol. Just as King Arthur became the symbol of chivalry and ideal rule, and Robin Hood the symbol of the fight for justice, Ragnar Lothbrok became the symbol of the indomitable northern spirit. His famous death in the snake pit is not a historical fact, but a mythological act, the perfect ending for such a symbol. Any other death would have been too small for him. Only one so theatrical and defiant could fully express the essence of this idea. Therefore, the question, what if his death is a lie, ultimately doesn't matter. That lie is his true reality, the reality in which he has continued to live for over 1,000 years. The physical death of the man, or men, who became the prototype for Ragnar Lothbrok was likely an insignificant event, unnoticed and unrecorded. Perhaps it was an arrow from an anonymous Irish warrior, a fever in a damp camp on the banks of the Seine, or simply the cold waters of the North Sea swallowing his ship. That death was the end of a biological existence, a period at the end of a biography. But the symbolic death, the one that occurred in the mythical snake pit, was, on the contrary, the act of his birth. It was the moment the mortal man finally died to make way for the immortal character of the great Scandinavian epic. Herein lies the great irony of his fate. All his life, as we have surmised, he chased glory, immortality in the songs of the skalds, and he received it, not for his real deeds, but for his fictional, brilliantly directed death. His journey ended not at the moment his heart stopped beating, but at the moment his story was finally written down and canonized by Icelandic authors. It was then that he dissolved completely into his own narrative, becoming inseparable from it. He ceased to be a subject of history and became its object, a character whose words and actions from then on belonged not to him, but to the collective memory of his people. His real self was sacrificed on the altar of his own legend. And this sacrifice wasn't in vain. It was precisely through this merger with myth that he gained the eternal life he craved. Today, millions of people around the world know his name, watch films and series about his life, and admire his courage and defiance. But they know and love not the historical Viking of the 9th century, but the literary hero of the 13th. They love the saga, not the man. And in this sense, his path ended in absolute triumph. He didn't just enter history, he became it. Ragnar Lothbrok's legacy extends far beyond the Viking Age, demonstrating the incredible resilience and adaptability of the myth created by him, or for him. In the immediate historical perspective, his legacy was the conquests of his sons and the creation of the Danelaw, a vast territory in England that lived under Scandinavian law, forever changing the cultural and political landscape of the island. The myth of him served as the justification and catalyst for these events. In the Middle Ages, his figure, immortalized in sagas and chronicles, became the model of the ideal pagan hero, an example of valor and cunning. For Scandinavian monarchs seeking to establish their power, tracing their lineage back to Ragnar and his sons was a way to legitimize their thrones. With the arrival of the Romantic era in the 19th century, Ragnar's second birth began. On the wave of nationalism, European peoples searched for their heroes in the distant past, and the Vikings, long considered mere savage barbarians, were reimagined as noble, freedom-loving warriors. Ragnar Lothbrok, with his rebellious spirit and heroic death, became the perfect symbol of this new interpretation. He appeared in operas, poems, and paintings, transforming into an icon of the romantic hero. In the 20th and 21st centuries, this transformation reached its peak in mass culture. Films, books, comics, video games, and of course, popular television series have taken up his story, adapting it for a modern audience. Today's Ragnar is a complex, ambiguous anti-hero, battling not only external enemies, but also his own inner demons, doubting his gods, and searching for the meaning of life. He has become a global cultural phenomenon, a symbol of nonconformity and the desire to live by one's own rules. And every time we see his image on the screen, we are witnessing the incredible power of myth-making. A story invented over 1,000 years ago to solve specific political problems has proven to be so powerful and universal that it continues to excite and inspire people today, proving that a well-told legend can, indeed, grant immortality. And so, we return to the central paradox, the legendary martyr versus the historical ghost. We can now give a final answer. The paradox is resolved by the fact that the beautiful lie of Ragnar's death was not just a falsehood. It was the most powerful and effective weapon the Vikings ever had in their arsenal. Its power lay in the fact that it was not the end of Ragnar's story, but its true, carefully crafted beginning. It was an act of creation that transformed a possibly mundane death, or even a collection of deaths of different historical figures, into a single event of colossal symbolic power. This legend became the detonator that set the great heathen army in motion. It became the banner that united thousands of warriors. It became the legal document that justified the conquest of England. It became the literary masterpiece that ensured Ragnar's eternal glory. In the Viking world, where the word of a skald was valued no less than the strike of a sword, creating such a powerful narrative was an act equal in importance to the greatest military victory. The lie proved more effective than the truth because it did the job the truth was incapable of doing. The truth was complex, boring, and useless. The lie was simple, inspiring, and incredibly functional. It transformed a dubious historical figure whose very existence is in question into the founding father of a dynasty, an icon of an entire era, and an eternal symbol of defiance. The paradox is that the historical Ragnar had to disappear, to be erased from the pages of real history, so that the mythical Ragnar could be born and live forever. His real death was a necessary condition for his symbolic immortality. Thus, his most famous lie became his greatest truth. Ultimately, the story of Ragnar Lothbrok goes far beyond the biography of one, albeit legendary, Viking. It becomes a universal parable about the very nature of history, memory, and myth. It shows us with perfect clarity that history is not a static set of facts carved in stone, but a dynamic, ever-changing battlefield. On this field, it is not armies that fight, but narratives, not warriors, but storytellers. In this battle, the winner is not the one on the side of truth, but the one whose story is more compelling, more inspiring, and more relevant to the needs of the time. The life and death of Ragnar is the greatest lesson on how the past belongs not to the dead, but to the living. It is we, the living, who choose what to remember and what to forget, which heroes to honor and which myths to pass on. We are constantly rewriting history, adapting it to our current values, fears, and hopes. Was Ragnar Lothbrok real? Did the snake pit exist? At a certain point, it ceases to matter. What matters is that his story has become part of our cultural code, a mirror in which we see the reflection of eternal human themes, the thirst for glory, the struggle with fate, the price of power, and the yearning to leave a mark on the world. The story of Ragnar Lothbrok is a hymn to the power of narrative. It reminds us that we are all characters in the stories we tell about ourselves and our world. And sometimes, as in the case of the great Viking, the most beautiful, most important, and truest story is the one that was brilliantly invented. And realizing this makes us look at all of human history, not just as a chronicle of events, but as the greatest saga ever told.